Hi, I'm your host, Marlo Lemon, and you're listening to Wild Voice, the podcast where I take this voice of mine and share my wild journey with you. Being widowed at 34 with a 15-month-old, most would see as life ending. And instead, I alchemized it and put life back together, and it became more beautiful and fulfilling than I could have ever imagined. Through this life shift of mine, I realized who I am and what I'm here to do. I'm an intuitive energy healer, and sharing how I view the world is how I help you upgrade your life and alchemize your journey into magic. From day one, I wanted to share my journey, call it intuition, but I knew it was going to do more good out in the world than keeping it to myself. So when I say I've mastered life, that doesn't mean I'm perfect or that life is. I mean, I've mastered the concept of life, and I want to share that with you. Hello, everyone. Well, where we left off last, I had just left my appointment with Dr. B and was back in my car when Bob called. I was fired up by the time I answered Bob's phone call. I knew he was at work, so I was curious how this conversation was going to go. I answered, and very quickly, the game changed again. I filled him in on the appointment and everything Dr. B had to say. Then I told him I had hit my limit and that he had 5 seconds to tell me the truth. He was quiet for a minute. Then the truth I got. He proceeded to tell me that the prostitute story wasn't true after all, and that he had been unfaithful majority of our relationship with men. At this point, nothing shocked me anymore. It was like I was preparing for this moment since I got his HIV news. I knew things weren't adding up, and here was my proof. I finally had some answers, and it was clear what I needed to do next. The more he talked and explained, the more questions I had. I was asking, and he was quickly answering, almost like neither of us were in our own bodies. I started asking questions I didn't really want the answers to. Bob had changed my and Nash's life forever. At the time, as you can imagine, I saw that as the most terrible thing. But thank goodness he changed our lives. The path we were on wasn't the caliber of life myself or Nash deserved. What I gathered from our 15-minute conversation as I drove home from Dr. B's to my parents, where Nash was that I didn't know Bob at all. That what marriage meant to me didn't mean the same thing to him. To me, it was sacred. It meant a bond and loyalty and having access to me that no one else gets. How could I have been so fooled? How did I miss this? Did I create his cheating by the way I looked? Did I make him gay? Was my whole life up to this point with him a lie? Was anything we had genuine and real? And who was this person that I was making dinner for every night and sleeping next to? My mind started to play back a lifetime together, and it was like a death. It was like flashing before my eyes. I was the light side of Bob's life, the representation in his eyes of when you do life right. But that wasn't all of him. That wasn't what was fulfilling him like he hoped. He had set up his life in a way that he could live both the light and dark side without the two meshing together. Until now. In his eyes, without me, that left only the shadow side of him that he hated more than anything. That meant without me, he thought all that was left was the darkness to him. He had wrapped his identity into me. We actually did that to each other. Bob let the fear of who he truly was at his core overpower him, which in turn got him running towards what he didn't want faster and faster. He didn't have the tools or awareness to see that who he was, no matter his choices, was worthy of a fulfilling life, even if that didn't look like the norm. But he never gave himself a chance to get there. Experiences in his past as a kid that got stuffed down and ignored was a breeding ground for limiting beliefs that fueled his sense of self. Not having ways to pivot and heal through things traumatic or painful will just build a life force of their own. It technically works against us. He proved himself right with every choice he made that he felt shame and guilt about. He continued to tell me that this lifestyle he was living is called the down low. Married men who have a wife and kids but sleep with men. He proceeded to defend it with all of his being and repeatedly making it clear he wasn't gay, along with anyone a part of the down low, almost like he was sticking up for all of them. I was thrown that these were the things he was defending. Whether he was gay or not actually wasn't even a question out of my mouth during our conversation. The answer to that had no value to me at this point. It didn't change what happened. It didn't hurt less. It did feel more final, though. Our marriage was way past saving. That meant I could finally let it go. It was clear this wasn't something I could fix. With each question that fell out of my mouth, it gave Bob a chance to hear his rationalizations out loud. I feel like he had rehearsed this situation before. My guess is probably since his diagnosis. His realization of what his words sounded like out loud, I picked up on immediately. I could tell he was ashamed of what he was defending, like he was realizing it in real time as he spoke the words to me. I learned that this all happened mainly during the workday and any time I was out of town. It was blowing my mind, because I would sometimes stop by his work randomly for lunch, or my parents would, or other family members. He was always there. He was never out of reach for long. I asked where, when, and how. My mind was spiraling, and I couldn't keep up. He told me he would go to people's houses, hotels, cars. The way he was rationalizing this all on our short 15-minute call was alarming. He told me it got more and more intense once I got pregnant, and it turned into group stuff. And the letter. There was a guy that wanted to date him, and when Bob tried to break it off, well, he got mad. He implied that happened often, to the point that he didn't know who that person was. There were many. Hence his reasoning for wanting to only hook up with other married men that are married to women. Because they have the same fears and the same things to lose. He said that pool of men got low after a while, so he created more options and less filters on his Grindr app. Before the app, it was Craigslist and AOL Instant Messenger. I asked if they knew he was married and if he wore his wedding ring. For some reason, this was important for me to know. He said he did wear his ring and that most liked that part, the thrill of it. I was sick to my stomach. It wasn't just Bob I felt devaluing our relationship. It was every person that was with him intimately that knew he was married. He made it clear that they knew about me, and once Nash was born, about him too. He had brought Nash and I into this way before this week. We were a part of this world with him without even knowing it. I was getting angrier and angrier, not even for the deceit, but for the fact that the night before, I stared into his eyes, mind bloodshot from the week he had put me through, and asked him to tell me the truth. I begged, one human being to another, and he still lied. Blown away by his answers and my mind spiraling, I pulled up to my parents' house and asked him what would be my last question about this topic. How many people? He paused and said, not that many. I was livid. In what world was that an okay answer for him to decide? Are you fucking kidding me? One is too many. He threw out a number nonchalantly. 15. Well, I knew that was a lie, and I was done being made a fool of. Bob abruptly tried to get off the phone, and I shot back furious that he would even think to get off the phone right now. He yelled back at me in that shaky, angry voice again. Told me he had gotten into a therapist's office, but the only one that would see him was through the lab he had gotten his blood work done. You know, the place he felt like he didn't belong at. He felt like he was being pawned off and like he was trash. He was reluctant, but he was going through the steps to do what needed to be done in his eyes. Our plan that evening before this phone call was to see him at home after work, and his mom was going to come over, make food, and help us go through bills. An effort to try and get our finances organized and a plan for each week for spending, paying bills, and even selling some of our assets, like my wedding ring. He pleaded, "Can we please talk more about this when I get home?" I took a deep breath. No, I'm done. You have pushed me to my limit. Nash and I won't be there when you get home. Your mom's here. You should be with her. I'll let her know. I still didn't want him to go through this alone, but it couldn't be me anymore. I had to think about Nash and I now. He told me he didn't want to stay at our house without us, though, and I told him I understood and that it's probably a good time for him to stay with his mom. I told him I had to go and ended the call, and I just stared. I sat in my car and stared. What just happened to my life? And oddly, though, everything made sense now. There was a sense of relief amongst the pain. It was like I finally had an answer for what I couldn't put my finger on this whole time. And it was go time, and I had a fierceness to me that hadn't been there in a really long time. I wasn't sad anymore. I was mad. And that anger was what was going to help get Maya and Nash's life back on track. As I got out of the car and started to head into my parents' house, I called Bob's mom. I wanted her to know things were changing and to keep him on her watch. I didn't want to go into detail. I figured I'd let him do that. I just knew I didn't want him to go through this alone. For as angry as I was at him, I still knew he was dealing with a lot. He was obviously dealing with something I had no understanding of and something that he had been processing for a really long time. When I called, she seemed like she had heard from him already. She knew he had an appointment and that he had planned to head her way after. I was relieved. I felt like he could be on someone else's watch, and now I could focus on what the fuck I was going to do next. I told her I would touch base later, and I hung up as I walked into my parents' house. It was quiet, but I could hear my mom talking and Nash giggling in the living room. I walked into the room and just stood there. My mom looked up at me. She was sitting on the floor with Nash, and I just shook my head. Mom, he's been lying this whole time. She jumped up, and I continued to fill her in as I called Dr. B's office. Waiting on hold, my mom and I just stared at each other in shock. Yet, and I knew it feeling at the same time. We knew there was something that wasn't adding up, that we couldn't put our finger on. Then Dr. B got on the phone, and what I told her, she didn't seem too surprised about. She made sure that she knew, that I knew, that she had my back, and that all that stuff was handled, and to just focus on what Nash and I were going to do next. I got off the phone to see my mom texting furiously. The house help, who are like family to all of us, were just as shocked by this last week's news. They were all in the kitchen, and my mom was directing people in every direction. As I got off the phone, I could see the shock on their faces as they looked over at me and were told that Nash and I were moving in. My mom said the apartment above the garage would be our spot now, and she called in the troops to start getting things ready. My dad was out of town for a work trip in Seattle, so we were going to need to do this on our own. A really small group of close friends knew something was going on, same with some of my siblings, but not many details. So the help wasn't something we were outsourcing quite yet. I was still processing this story, let alone needing to fill in other people. So I knew it was easier for us to do it on our own. I just needed out of my old life, and fast. And I wanted to be moved out before Bob was home from work, and that meant I had less than 4 hours to do all of it. With Nash taken care of and our dog Alvin in tow with me, I started the trips back and forth to our house to grab all the necessities. It was the most chaotic loading of shit I have ever done. I didn't want Bob to show up because I didn't want to see him or have any other conversations at the moment. I was focused. When I got to our house, it looked like a bomb had gone off. Our garage was still a mess from our trip. Suitcases hadn't been unpacked but sort of lived out of. And let's just say nothing besides surviving was happening at this point. As I was running to my car and just throwing things in, I realized I had no way to get a crib. So phone calls between my mom and I were happening every 20 minutes as I realized things like this, and more dividing and conquering was arranged. My mom went on a mission to find a crib and other odds and ends, and the constructive chaos continued for hours. There were people buzzing all around, and our next dilemma was setting up this crib. My mom called in another helper and a handyman to come help us put the crib together. Fun fact, he set up part of it backwards. I guess beggars can't be choosers. It started to get dark and things started to settle. I got what I felt I needed for the moment, and we were making beds and getting set up in our new home. As I was rushing around, I paused. I went to make the crib and realized I forgot Nash's mattress. And baby-proofing for the outlets and cabinets and a gate for the door. We were now at the top of a steep flight of stairs. Well, fuck. Frustrated, more with myself, I thought I can either get back in the car and continue this madness, or I can call Bob. He got us into this mess. He should help get us out. I decided to text him. I thought he could see Nash and help him get to sleep too. I was making life harder for me and Nash taking him out of the equation. He, of course, jumped on the opportunity, and a trip to our house and Target later, he was at our apartment door with his mom. We didn't say much to each other, but I handed him Nash and let him do the bath and bedtime routine while the rest of us rushed around finishing setting everything up. My mom walking in and out as things were getting set up, and Bob was giving Nash a bath in the sink. Let's just say there weren't many words spoken, but you could probably cut the tension with a knife. Once Nash was asleep, Bob and his mom left. Hours later, he texted, and he said, "I love you three." Me, Nash, and Alvin is who he was referring to. I was so angry. What was he trying to do? I responded to him, "You don't love me. This isn't what love is." I needed to start falling out of love with him, and he wasn't helping. I shot back that I needed to go to bed because Nash was going to be up soon for one of his 3 wake-ups through the night that, thanks to him, I was now doing alone. What I'd come to learn later is that night when I thought Bob left, he actually went into my parents' house to find my mom. She was sitting in the living room, watching TV. Bob and my mom had a close relationship. They were for sure like mother and son. He was her coffee buddy and always picked out the most beautiful just because flowers for her. He would tell me often to realize how lucky I was to have a mom like her. Even in the moments I was the most frustrated, I knew he was right. But I would just roll my eyes and be like, "Gosh, you two are each other's favorites." He would laugh, but I felt it when he said it. So the emotions this was bringing up for both of them was unbearable. He walked over to the fireplace. He was always cold, and with his back to the fire and my mom to his right, her almost looking past him at the TV, he just stood there with tears in his eyes. He was having a hard time making eye contact with her. If you know my mom, she's a tough nut to crack, especially if you have hurt her, the people she loves, or scared her in any way, which, as you can imagine, this was really scary for everyone in my family, anyone that knew us, even for Bob. She was showing no mercy. He told her he was going to make it right, and she told him to take care of his family. The conversation was tear-filled on Bob's end as he apologized, and he eventually walked out of the house. Little did my mom know it would be the last conversation she would have with him, the last time she'd see him. The next day was filled with lots of texts back and forth about what needed to get done, a very task-oriented day. And Bob decided to stay home from work that day, Wednesday, to get these things done. Amongst these texts, I was shooting down every "I'm sorry" he was sending, and making sure to remind him how much his choices really fucked everything up. I was hurt and I was mad. He made my choices and life and me look foolish. Amongst the whirlwind, I knew I needed to figure out my career. What was I going to do? Since retail was something I always bounced around with and was good at, but I did not like it, and I was done doing things I didn't like. I needed to make sure I could support Nash and I, though, and Bob's money needed to go to his health. So this was the next thing on my list of things I needed to tackle. As the morning went on, I started filling in my closest friends of what the hell was going on, and the fact that shit had really gone sideways, and that Nash and I had moved into my parents' house. Things were getting real, and it was moving fast, but it felt productive. I had to get out of the house at one point, so I decided to go to the grocery store to now fill up our new empty fridge. I had Nash with me and Alvin, and I got off the freeway and was waiting at the light when I looked up to see Bob's truck drive by. He didn't see us, but my stomach dropped. I would normally honk or call him to tell him I saw him, and instead, I just watched him drive by us with a pit in my stomach. Like I was watching my life drive by. Is this what it was going to be like now? I was going to have to see him, and he was going to be a reminder every time of all of this terrible stuff, and a reminder to be sad. My trance broke when the car behind me honked because the light turned green. My heart hurt so bad. It got halfway through the day before Bob started asking to come and see Nash. He used the things I needed from the house and our dog Alvin's food as a reason to come over to see him. But I needed more space. I didn't want him around that day. He fought for it. And I was going 100 miles a minute, and I didn't want to stop to deal with it. So I told him no. and he acted like he would hold on to the things that I needed until I would let him see Nash. Whether that was his intention or not, it made me furious. I finally told him if he held the things hostage I needed to just function through the day, we were going to have a problem. I put my phone down out of frustration and left the apartment. I went downstairs into my parents' house to check on Nash and to grab a few things. Everyone was really good during this time of helping me with Nash. They probably figured I had a lot on my mind and on my plate, so there were a lot of hands on deck helping me with him. I made a few trips back and forth, and while I was in the house, I saw something catch my eye out front. I walked to my parents' front door and looked out the window. It was Bob's truck. It was parked across from their gate in the visitor parking area. I could tell his car was still running. I just stared, confused, wondering what he was doing. For some reason, I got really nervous. And I felt like it wasn't good, whatever it was, and I had a bad feeling. I went to grab my phone, thinking it was in the kitchen. I realized I had left it in the apartment. I went back to the window and saw now the car was off, and Bob was opening the tailgate of his truck. For some reason, there was some relief in seeing him. I missed him terribly. When things didn't go right, or I was worried or scared, he was the person that I would go to. He was the person that would fix it. And now all of this was going on, and he was the last person I could go to about it. He was the cause of it, so he couldn't be the solution. He had created time to fall out of love with me, and I had to do it overnight. So seeing him was hard. He started unloading all of the things from his car that I had asked for, and then some. I watched him as he crossed the street with each load, and instead of coming in or opening the gate, he just lifted it over the gate and set it down on the ground. More sadness set in. That we were even at this point. Bob was literally a part of my family, in so many ways. If you would have told me I would ever see a day he wouldn't feel welcomed or allowed, I would have said you were batshit crazy. Worried he would see me if I went to go grab my phone from the apartment, I waited until he was done unloading and heading back to his car. I ran outside really quick and up the stairs to the apartment to get my phone. I glanced at it, and as I was heading right back into the house, I saw I had missed calls from him and texts. Texts he had been sending while he was sitting out front, before unloading the car and right after. He said he brought the things over and was hoping maybe he could see Nash. When he didn't get a response, he said he would put the things on the other side of the gate, but felt really bad about that and wished I would just respond. He was just wanting to help me carry them up. And he thought I was ignoring him. At this point, I saw his car start to drive away, and I felt terrible. I called his mom right away, figuring she was in the car with him. She answered, and I quickly realized she wasn't with him. I was shocked, and my stomach dropped. I didn't want him alone, for the fact I felt bad for him, that this was a lot to process, and to do something like that, drop off all of our stuff and not be allowed in, and to do that alone, I figured that was a lot to process, on top of everything else. But she was adamant that she asked him, and he didn't want her to go, said that he was fine, and he wanted to do it alone, in hopes that maybe he'd have time to see Nash. I felt frustrated and sad for a lot of reasons. We talked for a bit, and I asked how he was doing. She filled me in, giving me the idea he was doing okay. I had let her know that he had left and was heading back, so she knew to expect him. She continued to say, given the circumstances, she thought he was doing all right. It was also brought up that he was a victim to the times and technology and the internet. I felt like excuses were being made for him, but to be honest, I didn't have the energy to fight that. We were starting to talk about how long she'd be in town for and when Bob's brother and his family was heading back from spring break. They were out of town at the time in Hawaii and were getting back early Friday morning. Bob and his mom were staying at their house while they were gone. She mentioned wanting to head home to regroup Friday once they were back. And I mentioned that maybe Bob going back with her would be a nice break. It was also going to be Easter that Sunday, and I wasn't sure what that was going to look like for us. I didn't want him to stay back, not knowing what our plan was going to be, or if my family was going to allow him over, or what that even looked like. Our conversation was cut short when she told me he had pulled up. I was relieved. I also didn't want him to think we were talking about him in anything other than a constructive way, so I wanted to make sure we got off the phone before he came into the house. I told her we'd check in later. The day went on and I could tell Bob was running around doing all the things. I got updates as he dropped off our taxes, was cleaning and organizing and staging our house. My best friend Par, who is the owner and principal broker of our own real estate company, was helping us. Best case scenario. Talk about having a best friend that can help you get your house ready to sell in a day. She was wanting details, but I wasn't giving too much, just implying it was bad. And if you know Par, that wasn't getting her very far. And Bob wasn't telling anyone, so knowing it was going to start to be obvious, he had sent a group text to our guy group of friends to fill them in. And I respected that he didn't want to tell people details, but I did tell him that it's not fair for people to think that he cheated once, and I just walked away from our marriage and our life together. He made sure in his text to tell them it was his fault we were separating and left it at that. Bob started texting me as it got later in the day, and the words he was using and the way he was engaging didn't sound like him. It started to scare me a bit, to be honest. I wasn't sure if his mom was telling him what to write or therapists, but all I knew was it wasn't the Bob I knew. Even his vocabulary seemed different. Then I thought, maybe this is the real Bob. Maybe he's starting to show me who that is. Maybe the Bob I thought I knew wasn't really him. I told him his words were confusing me and something was off. He started texting and being very short. As efficient and effective as text arguing is, I wanted to just talk this out on the phone. Then he texted, "You let me know when I can come pick up my son and my dog, and I'll be there in a second." I was livid. Who was this person? And the way he was talking felt erratic and all over the place. So I called him. That same time, my mom just happened to come up to the apartment to check on us and saw things were getting heated on the phone with Bob. So she scooped up Nash and took him into their house. Bob and I were finally yelling at each other. It was like after all of this, neither of us were able to really be angry with each other, and here we were. I yelled to him. The way that he was acting was scaring me. I couldn't have him coming over and falling apart with Nash and not knowing what to expect or what version of him I was going to get, or Nash. I knew at this time him seeing Nash wasn't so much for Nash as it was for him. My biggest focus was protecting Nash. I felt like I had done a real shitty job up to this point with the situation we were in, what we were dealing with, but going forward, that was going to be different. I made it clear he needed to be strong and stable for Nash, that he couldn't be coming over, crying and gripping to Nash to try and make him strong. It needed to be the other way around. Bob needed to be strong for Nash, not Nash doing that for Bob. When I look back on that conversation we had, there were for sure some cringeworthy moments. My perspective on life was so different and what I thought healing should look like. Little did I know, Nash knowing Bob was human and remorseful for his choices wasn't so bad after all. There's just a fine line of burdening a 15-month-old with that. He got very defensive with me on the phone, then the energy went stale, like dead energy. If you've ever experienced that, it was quiet, it was uncomfortable, like the calm before the storm. Then he said, in a monotone voice that I'd never heard him use before. It actually gives me goosebumps every time I talk about this. He said, "Well, sounds like being honest with you is keeping my son from me. So, in that case, I'm doing great. Now let me see my son." I shot back that this is exactly the type of thing that is making me uncomfortable. I told him, "You're going back and forth and not sounding like yourself." Then it went quiet again, and he said, "Well, isn't that the definition of unstable?" I froze, and my stomach dropped. It was eerie, and I didn't know what to say next. I don't even know what that left for me to say. And then he said, "Thank you. Thank you for protecting Nash from me." My body froze, and I felt the most uneasy I'd felt up to this point. And I was confused. What was happening to him? All I could think of next was the truth. So I told him, This is exactly the sort of stuff that I'm talking about and the reason why you can't come over. Then in a calm voice that I could tell was filled with anger, he said it again. Will you just let me know when I can come pick up my kid and my dog, and I'll be there in a second. It felt abrasive, and I felt like I was losing trust in him with Nash the more he was talking. What was happening? How did we get here so quickly? The only thing is I felt zero guilt. I knew he was confirming exactly what I was thinking and that I was making the right choice that day. But I was worried about what was going on with him. All of that aside, now my focus was on what was going on with Bob. After some more yelling and arguing, I finally was able to get out and confirm that this wasn't forever. This was for today. Based on how things were going and still figuring out a plan. I let Bob know that was never my plan, not my intention to keep him and Nash apart. Ever. I know that's not, no matter what choices Bob made, I know that's not what was going to be in the best interest for Nash. And that's what mattered to me. As this got more clear and we both brought the walls down, he started telling me about his therapist appointment the other day. He said he made a safety plan. I had no clue what that was, so he filled me in. A safety plan is something professionals suggest doing when you're in crisis. One that helps give you just that, a written plan if you feel like you are unsafe, whether that's towards yourself or others. You pretty much write on a paper a series of gradually escalating steps that you follow until you feel ultimately safe. Now, my thoughts on this I'll bring up in a later episode. But for the idea of this and what Bob used it for and was guided through, was there about 3 things that were suggested for Bob to have on his list. To not be alone, to have a plan for that. And when he had thoughts like that, or felt unsafe, to call a friend, a family member, suicide hotline, therapist. And if he had any thoughts of suicide, he needed to reach out to someone, which he confirmed and said he didn't. He thought this was all really extreme. And the 3rd step is to go to the emergency room. He acted very nonchalant and almost annoyed, like he was doing everything everyone was telling him, but nothing was getting him the immediate goal of seeing Nash. He told me this was the 2nd safety plan he had made. Since one of the items was to call the hotline, he did that earlier that afternoon with his mom, and he made another safety plan that had the same information on it. And he signed it like they suggest, and that's it. His irritation was with the idea that all anyone was doing was telling him to make a plan on paper and sign it, but nothing was really tangible or making him feel any better. So I just listened. This was serious, and no matter how mad I was at him, I always very quickly got back to being compassionate because this, I could only imagine. I couldn't even relate to how he was feeling. That's how bad I knew this was. The longer our conversation went on, his demeanor was more like the Bob I knew again, and I started to feel a little bit relieved. He was calm, collected, and we were doing a really good job listening to each other. He started to tell me he got his results back from his lab work from that Monday when we were in the specialist's office. They ran a full STD panel on him to just be sure, to rule everything out, and to check his levels of HIV. This would tell them what stage he was in, and most likely if this was a recent encounter or not. Of course, I still cared about him. As a person, as Nash's dad. That doesn't just turn off overnight my feelings for him. So very eager to hear how that all went, he filled me in. He said, ironically, he didn't have any STDs. Besides HIV, that is. He was nailing the awkward jokes lately. His HIV level was very low. It was in the lowest bracket. That's the best case scenario. So that meant a couple things. One being that it was recently contracted, so that followed along with his story. And the other, that once on medication, he could get his levels down to undetectable. This was the best case scenario for a terrible situation. The last thing he mentioned was that his vitamin D levels were extremely low. He said it was practically non-existent. Being in this health world with my family and their interest in all of that and seeing naturopaths, and I knew how important vitamin D is. I knew off the bat that those levels could be a huge indicator and part of his moods and his overall health. So getting that boosted was a priority as well. He was still acting a bit defeated, but relieved. We both were. I told Bob I had to go to get Nash situated for dinner, and we got off the phone. It was weird to have no plan on when we were going to talk again, but I had to just let it be. I went into my parents' house and got Nash's dinner ready. My mom made her and I dinner, and I fed Nash, and we just watched TV. There was some calmness to the obscure chaos. I got Nash to bed that night and felt sad. It was like my best friend had become a monster and stranger all at once. I didn't want it that way. I just didn't know what else to do besides put my guard up. I was in survival mode, and I had someone else to look out for. I went to bed, but before I did, I heard a text come through, and it was Bob. He said again, "I love you 3. My eyes started to water. I felt like he wasn't letting me move on. I started to get angry. Was this a sick game? Bob did love us to his capacity and definition of what love was to him, but his definition was fucked up. We got here, though, because mine must have been too. I was with him for 13 years. I never questioned it or the way that he loved me or the way that I loved him. It takes 2 people to be a match in anything, in any experience, especially to create the type of shit show that was playing out for us. And I had no clue. Bob's choices ultimately let me see that. His choices would help me love differently down the road, which in turn meant breaking that cycle for Nash too. The next morning, I had a new feeling in my soul. I was motivated. I was ready. I was going to have my first workout session and get signed up for this Beachbody business. This is what I could do for a career, and I was excited about it. I could get myself healthy and back in shape and do something that I always loved. Fitness was a huge thing, and it was something I was not doing over the last year. So first things first, on top of that, I changed my profile picture on social media. Pictures of me and Nash. And I changed passwords. I did this all from my bed, like this was the very most important first thing I needed to do. I felt like I was taking my life back, and who the hell would have thought that this was where I would start? I knew Bob was going back to work today, Thursday, and he was really unsure of how this whole situation was going to go. He was very worried about losing his job with just the fact of someone finding out he had HIV. I knew his mind was spiraling, and he was getting paranoid and worried. His ultimate worry was not only for the fact of losing his job, but what losing his job meant, which meant also losing his insurance. The medication he needed to be on now for the rest of his life was $2,000 a month before insurance. The specialist made sure to tell us that even if he lost insurance, to not stop the medication, that there is always a way to figure something out. He implied many of his patients would stop the medication for this reason and not let him know. And then their HIV levels would spike, along with their overall health declining, and their diagnosis would shift into some most advanced stages of HIV, which leads to AIDS. And that ultimately was what we were trying to prevent. Since that appointment days earlier, this was weighing heavy on Bob. It was a big topic of conversation. It was consuming him, so much so I felt like it was something he needed help navigating. Amongst my small circle that knew what was going on, one of my friends worked in HR, so I knew she understood this world a little bit more than I did. So I thought she could be a resource for me to figure out what Bob's options were without Bob having to ask these questions to his employer. So I filled her in on everything, and she helped me look up his company guidelines and what they offered and what was expected of him legally. And all in all, it was good news. It was a breath of fresh air. I made sure to pass it along to Bob that morning. I wanted him to know before he got into work that he was protected and that what his options were. He was appreciative, and our conversations back and forth that morning were better than they had been in a long time. Still very task-oriented, but better. I felt hopeful. It was my first day I was starting to feel like I could breathe. So after getting situated with my new morning routine, which now entailed Beachbody workouts and smoothies, I started to see what things I was still missing from our house. Since I had this newfound drive to take care of myself, naturally I needed my blender, and that was still at our house. I guess it was one of those things in the initial chaotic emergency move I didn't find too important. Par was also not letting things go, and another day had gone by without us catching up. So mind you, at 9 months pregnant, with her fourth little chicklet, she said I better come over and fill her in before she had this baby, or else. I was actually looking forward to getting out of the house, and her house was close to our house where I was going to need to grab my blender. So I figured it was a win-win. I pulled up to our house to run in, and Par was already calling. I answered, telling her what I was doing, and she told me to just get over there now, that her twins were napping and the time clock was already ticking. So knowing there was some truth to that, and that this blender would still be there after her and I were talking and hanging out, that I could grab it on my way home when I had to go back and relieve the babysitter who was watching Nash. And I told her, okay, fine. I will come to you, but I have to leave by 4, and I'll just come by and grab it on my way home. I got to Par's house, and I spent the next few hours filling her in and practically picking her jaw up off the floor. What was most shocking, like to the rest of us, was that Bob was the one doing these things. It didn't make sense. It was unimaginable. When I tell you, he showed every single person that knew him the opposite of someone who would be capable of this, I'm not exaggerating. How did he keep that up for so long? A lifetime. There are still people that are dumbfounded by that. And that the person that he showed up as, they were so night and day. Now, although all of the above is true, we were shocked. Bob was dishonest and manipulative. But what about the men that knew Bob in the other life he was living? If you ask them that same question, they'd probably say they thought he was extremely authentic and honest. They got the most honest and complete version of him. They knew about me and Nash, his struggles with the 2 lives he was living, and they got him intimately on all levels, emotionally and physically. So how come they got to have the most honest and vulnerable version of him, and I didn't? Sexual preferences aside, how come to me he was deceitful and dishonest, and to them he was truthful and vulnerable? They felt for him that he was stuck between these 2 worlds. And here I was hurt and upset with him that he shut me out and was reckless with not only his life, but mine and Nash's as well. I'd learned more about how some of these men felt about Bob, because they would start to reach out to me to look for him. The hours felt like minutes, and before I knew it, I had cut it short to go get Nash. I realized being so caught up in what Par and I were talking about, I hadn't paid attention to my phone, and I had missed calls from Bob and texts showing his concerns for me not responding. He was worried now and panicking, wondering what he was up against when it came to Nash. It had been an hour or so since his last text, and it was now 4 p.m. I knew he had finally gotten into that therapist appointment that he was referred to and had an appointment at 5. So my hope was I could probably catch him in the car. I had a pit in my stomach as I left Par's, the fact that Bob thought I was intentionally ignoring him. I was eager to call him back. I wanted him to know that that's not what was happening. So I rushed out the door and jumped into my car, and as I was leaving Par's, I called Bob back. He was calm, and so was I, and he asked what I was doing. I just told him I was heading back to go get Nash. I could tell he was curious where I had been, but felt like he had lost the right to ask much else, and I wasn't giving in. I started in by telling him I was not ignoring him, and that I just didn't have my phone on me. I continued to tell him my goal is to not keep Nash from him, confirming that makes everyone's life harder. That's the last thing I wanted, especially for Nash. I just needed him to get a plan together for his process, and we could continue to talk through it. He started in on his day and filling me in on what he had found out from work, that the information I had passed on was accurate, and that they have paid leave and he would get his same job back when he returned if it came to that. With all of this, I had reiterated to him my thoughts about a once-a-week therapy session, not feeling like that was going to be the most beneficial or the only thing that needed to be done, and that we probably needed more support than that. We both equally came to the idea that maybe a rehab or inpatient sort of environment would be best, to just hit the ground running and start tackling things one by one. He made it very clear he would do whatever I wanted if it meant he could see Nash. And I let him know him getting better in all areas and seeing a plan in place was all I needed. I told him I would even bring Nash and we would come and visit him. I needed his actions to follow his words. This wasn't something that we could just sit with and it would go away. We needed help. It was a positive conversation, and I felt a sense of relief for all of us. I felt like we were finally turning a corner. He started going into more detail as I pulled up to our house on my way back home to get Nash. I wanted that damn blender, and here I was again, on the phone, parked outside, contemplating coming back. Again. I didn't want to cut off Bob while he was talking, or possibly upset him by telling him I was at our house picking up more things. So after about 5 minutes, I could tell our conversation wasn't ending anytime soon, so I drove off for the second time. Bob and I continued to talk, and I felt like it was the best conversation I've ever had with him. We were seeing each other at our most raw and vulnerable, and we were actually communicating effectively, and in a way that honestly felt like it was fueled with love. It made my heart happy that we were here, that we could do this. I felt hopeful for us, for Nash, and for whatever this next chapter was going to look like. I felt powerful. The first time in 10 days, that was going to be short-lived. And within hours, life was going to change again. Thanks so much for being here. Please rate, like, share, and review so we can stay connected and continue this magical journey together.